So Louisville joining the ACC last season, taking dead aim at Clemson and Florida State in the tougher Atlantic Division. But the Cardinals off to a rough start here in 2013 or 2015. That would be hoping to right the ship as they did last week against North Carolina State, and then took in a bye. We bring in Mike McDaniel of Inside the ACC to help us break down pretty important game here with the Cardinals taking on Florida State with the Noles at 5-0. So, Mike, let's set it up with Florida State. The undefeated record, the impressive comeback in the fourth quarter, played really well down the stretch against Miami, but it's still a struggling offense for Florida State against the likes of Wake Forest, South Florida, Boston College. They've not been able to score past the mid-20s.
Yeah, I think incrementally, week by week, you're starting to see a little bit more of Everett Golson throwing the football, and I think that's something to watch for again this week. Is Everett Golson going to be let loose a little bit more in the offense? Jimbo Fisher's been easing him in, using a lot of Dalvin Cook in the running game to try to open up the passing game for Everett Golson. Without a doubt, as we saw at Notre Dame, when he has full control of the offense and he's playing well and not turning the football over, he can be a very effective player, and he has a huge arm. He can throw it deep down the field, make every pass that he needs to make on the college level. But I think what you're seeing right now is for Florida State, they're kind of easing him in. They're kind of holding the reins back a little bit. They really just need to let him loose and let him go. I think what Jimbo Fisher's a little bit afraid of, and he dealt with this a little bit with Jameis Winston last year, is that if you let your quarterback do a little bit too much when he's not ready, he can turn the football over. I'm not saying Jameis Winston wasn't ready necessarily last year, but you saw it when his freshman year when he won the Heisman Trophy. Beginning of the year, they were kind of easing him in a little bit, but we saw that he had all the tools to become the Heisman Trophy winner that he was. I'm not saying Everett Golson's necessarily on that same level. Yes, he garnered some Heisman consideration, especially after the Notre Dame game against Florida State last year. I'm not saying he doesn't have the talent to be mentioned, in that name pool if he was, throwing for 300, 400 yards every week, but he does struggle with the turnover bug, much like Jameis Winston did last year and the year before at Florida State. So I think Jimbo Fisher, based off of some past experiences, he's kind of easing him in. And what we saw last week is Golson was very efficient, and he threw the ball 33 times, completed 25 passes for 291 yards and 3 touchdowns in that game last week. And we saw a huge game from Kermit Whitfield, the receiver for Florida State. He made a couple big plays down the field, had 95 yards receiving. So I think with Florida State, it's, okay, how open are your receivers going to get? They got Bobo Wilson and Kermit Whitfield, 2 guys that can stretch the field. They also have a 6'5" freshman named George Campbell, and he can go down the field and make some plays for them as well, but he's been held back a little bit as well. I'm not sure if it's a grasping of the playbook sort of thing or what, but he's only a true freshman. So I think we'll see more of him in the future, but he's a big-time target. So it's not like the Seminoles don't have the ability to stretch the field. They do have some playmakers on the outside. But what you're going to see is a lot of Dalvin Cook. He's coming off of a game where he ran for 222 yards and a couple touchdown passes. He caught 3 passes out of the backfield for 49 yards and an additional touchdown last week. And what you're seeing out of Dalvin Cook is another season where he's kind of putting the Seminoles on his back, carrying the football a ton, and kind of limiting the passing arsenal a bit because they don't have to do as much if Cook is carrying a brunt of the load. So I think you're going to see a lot of that again on Saturday against Louisville.
Putting the Seminoles on his back, I think you hit the key point right there, because everyone across the nation is going crazy about Leonard Fournette right now, and rightfully so. The action that I've seen for Florida State, starting with the South Florida game, I saw much of that game, and South Florida, yes, South Florida probably would have defeated Florida State. They were within a score most of that game. Dalvin Cook made about 4 or 5 ridiculous runs in that game. Obviously, you mentioned the numbers against Miami. He was incredible in that game. I think at this point, he's got an argument, not necessarily for the Heisman, but if there was a college football MVP for a team, considering the offensive struggles of this team, and really the offensive line for Florida State is not up to the standards that we've seen with the likes of Trey Jackson and others up front that were NFL first-round picks. So Dalvin Cook with a big effort thus far through 5 games. You mentioned Golson. I don't remember the turnover situation against Miami. I don't think he had any turnovers. So it's something that he's cleaned up after just being a turnover machine with like 29 last year as a freshman in leading Notre Dame to the national championship game. He was very conservative, and they kept him under wraps and protected the football, and he had the one aberration of a year. So hopefully for Florida State fans, he is back to protecting the football, even when they decide, as you mentioned, that they need to open it up against the better teams.
Yeah, and just adding on to what you're saying, I'm not saying Dalvin Cook necessarily is a Heisman contender right now. It's Leonard Fournette's trophy to lose, and I think we've seen what he's done in the SEC. But Everett Golson, Everett Golson, excuse me, I was talking about Dalvin Cook. Dalvin Cook is a Heisman Trophy guy potentially down the line because of his ability to run the football. And I actually wrote a column for a separate site saying that, if Dalvin Cook was given the amount of carries Leonard Fournette has been given over the first 5 weeks of the season, Cook's numbers would be identical to Leonard Fournette's. He'd have a couple more yards if you projected it over the same path as he's doing right now, and Leonard Fournette would have more touchdowns. So it would be legitimately a toss-up between Fournette and Cook if Cook was getting the carries, if Fournette was getting. Obviously, LSU's quarterback situation is a little bit different than Florida State's. I think Florida State, has a legitimate quarterback there with Everett Golson. We've seen him under center for Notre Dame in the past. He is a competent quarterback when he's not turning the football over. Brandon Harris at LSU, he's been hit and miss in the passing game. He's not completing a huge percentage of his passes. I believe right now it's a little bit less than 60% currently. So they got a little bit of a different situation there, and Fournette has obviously deserved all the attention that he's gotten. But Dalvin Cook definitely can make his name known if he has some big games, perhaps down the line against a Clemson. For example, that could end up, deciding the Atlantic Division. So it's something to watch for further down the line.
Mike, I saw an interesting take on the Florida State defense this week where there were a lot of comments, a lot of quotes from that locker room talking about the situation last year coming off the national championship in 2013, where a lot of kids were so NFL ready in terms of talent, and regardless of the results on the field, we're going to go well into the NFL draft. A lot of juniors that maybe the eye was taken off the prize. They were looking ahead to the NFL draft. There wasn't quite the motivation and the focus that there should have been. Now, it's interesting this year because while Florida State continues to recruit with anybody in the country, they have a number of guys on defense. Newberry was one in particular who batted down the last gasp effort for Miami, and Brad Kyle last week, who's a fifth-year senior. So more so than any of the recent Florida State additions we've seen, they've got like 4 or 5 key fifth-year seniors, guys that didn't necessarily play a ton earlier in their careers, but now they're being counted on, not necessarily as stars, but as key impact players on that Florida State defense. Your thoughts about the Louisville offense, what they bring to the table? Of course, we've dissected the quarterback situation in the past and kind of set everyone up for the choice that Bobby Petrino had at that point. And Lamar Jackson's the guy, and he is a dynamic player outside the pocket, but still struggling to find the right guy, make the right decision, anticipate the throws.
Yeah, Lamar Jackson is definitely talented enough to play quarterback at Louisville in the system that they have in place. He has still struggled to throw the football. He's coming off of a 10 for 27 performance against NC State in a win 2 weeks ago for just 103 yards, but he carried the ball 19 times for over 120 yards in that game and scored a touchdown on the ground. So what you're seeing with Lamar Jackson is his ability with his feet to put Louisville in a position to win, which couldn't be said about some of the other quarterbacks they had on their roster early on in the season. When Lamar Jackson came in the opener against Auburn, he was impressive. He got the Cardinals back in the game. Then they kind of went away from Jackson. Then they went back to Jackson, and they weren't utilizing him in the same fashion that they did against Auburn. But now what you're seeing against Samford, which it is Samford, but they put up 45 points on offense. Lamar Jackson had a great game there. He had another nice game against NC State on the ground. He's a playmaker. So what Louisville's banking on is their playmakers to go out there and make plays and do what they're supposed to do. Lamar Jackson is just another weapon to have out there on offense. So it makes sense that they're going with him at quarterback, and rightfully so. He's winning them football games currently, so why go away from the hot hand? I think what you need to watch here in this game against Florida State's secondary has struggled a ton in recent weeks. Jalen Ramsey has struggled in one-on-one coverage. He's considered by many to be one of the top cornerbacks in the country. And what you're seeing with him is he's been forced into a position where he's playing a lot of field corner. He's playing a lot of man-to-man defense there on the outside. He's getting exposed a little bit in man-to-man coverage. He probably projects more to a safety in the NFL, which was his original position at Florida State. And he's played a little bit in the nickel as well. So they've tossed him a lot of different places there for the Seminoles, but they're kind of thin there. Trey Marshall is going to be out for the first half of this game and he's their starting safety. He's going to be out because he got called for targeting in the first quarter against Miami. So that means that you're out for the rest of the game in the first half of the following game. So that's something to watch in the first half. But the thing about NC State is they're having so much trouble throwing the football right now. I don't know if they'll be able to expose the flaws of Florida State secondary, just like a team like Miami was able to do last weekend, because Florida State seemed like they had that game in hand in the first half. Then Brad Kaya got hot and Miami came storming back. I think if Louisville goes down and is forced to throw the football, they're in a lot of trouble, especially if the Florida State defense is able to key on that rushing attack of Louisville and kind of contain Lamar Jackson in that pocket and make him throw down the field. If they're able to do that, I'm not sure there's a way Louisville will score enough to keep up with Florida State, and that's even with a Florida State offense that's only averaging in the mid-20s per game.
Mike, we're getting to a point in the season where these teams are just starting to have a track record. So you can pick the conference, pick the team, pick the matchup. It doesn't matter. The value of these victories and the losses, they change every week. So one week a victory looks pretty good, and then the team that you defeated lose 2 consecutive games, and it doesn't the perception of the win or the loss changes. So for Louisville, it's week 1 out of the gate. They lose to an Auburn team that was ranked in the top 5 in the country. We find out very quickly that the value of that loss wasn't great. Louisville stumbles. They fall off the radar, but they come back in the ACC. They actually had played Clemson in that Thursday night game, only lost by 3 points, but come back in that North Carolina State game, which they traveled on the road, take on the Wolfpack, win that game fairly impressively by a touchdown the weekend of all the bad weather. And now they've got a bye week. Flip side for Florida State, yeah, they beat Miami, but they were taken to the end of this game, to the fourth quarter, a final drive. They only win by 5, and it's a Miami team that lost to Cincinnati. So how do you shake this one out and look at the Louisville Cardinals taking on Florida State in Tallahassee?
Well, yeah, just like you said, I don't want to repeat absolutely everything you said, but I agree with almost all of your points there. NC State is not a team that played anybody in the non-conference schedule. They were 4-0, and then they play Louisville, and they lose. And then they go the following week to get to Blacksburg to play Virginia Tech on a Friday night, and they lose again. So now we know about a lot more about NC State and how big really was that Louisville win 2 weeks ago, right before their bye week. They start off the season 0-3, and then they beat a Samford team that's, not very good. They beat them 45-3, and then they beat the Wolfpack 20-13, and this NC State team is not very good either now. And, they just lost to a Virginia Tech team that's really struggling. So we don't know a ton about these teams, but like you said, they're starting to establish a little bit of a track record. And with Louisville, I'm still sitting here wondering, who have they played? And Florida State, at least Florida State has gone up against a Boston College defense that's an elite defense in the country, and that's something you can point to. Yes, Miami took them to the wire. Florida State's not a perfect team by any means, and I think that game against Miami, except for a Dalvin Cook performance, which was spectacular, and Everett Golson held his own as well at quarterback. But, what it really exposed was more flaws with that Florida State team. You saw a lot of flaws in the secondary. You saw some flaws with their pass rush. And you saw some flaws at times with the offensive line became a little bit stagnant. And Dalvin Cook was actually held up in the backfield a couple different times where it looked like he had a hole, and then all of a sudden the hole closed up real quick, and the offensive line kind of was a little bit stop and go in that game as well. Overall, they played well, but what you saw was, are they going to be consistent over a full 60 minutes in this football game against Louisville this weekend? And ultimately, what's that going to lead to? Is it going to lead to a lot of points, or is it going to be another mid-20s performance? And will Florida State give up a couple cheap touchdowns to Louisville to keep them in the game? That's something I'm going to watch. Florida State comes into this game as a 7.5-point favorite. I think that spread is too low, in all honesty. That spread, in my opinion, should be more like 10 or 11 points. I think Florida State is a much better team than Louisville, and they're a better team than they're getting credit for in this game. I'm not sure that Louisville is going to be able to throw, and I think the Florida State defense, the front seven, will be able to at least contain Lamar Jackson enough in the pocket to make him throw the football. And I think if they make Lamar Jackson throw the football, they're going to win this game. So I like Florida State big in this one. It's a game that they're coming off the Miami victory. It's a big emotional victory. If they come out flat, I think Louisville's got a chance to hang in there and perhaps make some noise here late in the game. But we'll just have to see. But I think Florida State will come out motivated and ready to play, and I like them big in this one.
Yeah, Mike, all good points. Louisville probably is best performance of the season was actually in a loss at home against Clemson. They came within 3 points. Deshaun Watson with not a good night. The odds makers could possibly be looking at that. Obviously, Florida State, as we have chronicled over the last few minutes, struggling on offense, not scoring a ton of points, not a vintage Florida State offense. That could tie into the point spread as well. But as long as Dalvin Cook's on the field, and I think the point that you make about Louisville being one-dimensional, Florida State's defense should be able to eat that up. They're not going to be wowed by athleticism on the part of Lamar Jackson and the Louisville offense. So Florida State Louisville should be an interesting one. It's the last gasp for the Cardinals to stay in the division race. They have to win this one. Of course, Florida State has an eye on a bigger prize in winning the championship in the division and possibly getting to the playoffs. So Mike McDaniel from inside the ACC. Mike, thanks so much for helping us break it down.
Thanks, Mark.